Hello everybody, CritCrab here with another story, this one about a Karen that pulled out all the stops to try and get somebody fired from the game store. But there was just one problem. He didn't work at the game store, making herself look like a complete idiot. Anyways, I would like to introduce the crab that brings me the posts from our subreddit. Introduce yourself, Shell. Classic Shell.
Now back to the story mines.
Anyways, roll post. This story takes place over a decade ago. I had just graduated high school and things were looking pretty good back then. Iron Man had just kicked off the MCU, Obama was on track to be the next US president, and Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition had just released. Not a bad summer at all, and it got even better after getting a rather late acceptance letter to Blank University. I was excited about it, but moving halfway across the country was going to put a damper on just one thing. I was running an ongoing 3.5e campaign for my friends at the time. All 5 of us had been very close friends since kindergarten. We had been playing D&D together since we started high school, and I was our forever DM because, and I quote, "You do the best voices." Nothing to do with my improvisational or creative writing skills. Regardless, we always had fun at the table. The campaign I had been running for the past year was our first homebrew game, and we had been having a lot of fun with it, especially with the roleplay. It was a campaign for evil PCs, so I was very lax on what was considered acceptable roleplay behavior at the table. Despite the levity, the players never descended into being carefree murder hobos. Each of their characters had depth and motivation just as any heroic character would have had. I'm not saying there wasn't murder, thievery, rape, and other vile things, but it was all done with restraint and purpose with regards to the character or the story. I had a lot of fun with that campaign, and it saddens me to say that we never got to properly wrap it up. We played our game at the only game store in 30 miles. It was pretty big for where we lived, like the Walmart of game stores, a nerd's oasis in the heart of corn country. The store had several decent-sized tables for players off to one side of the store. There was another smaller table in a weird spot around a random wall that just jutted out from the back of the store and separated it from the rest of the play area. This was one of those flimsy, padded folding tables that had absolutely seen better days. It could only seat 4 people. There was no leg room, and the padding was popping out of the frame. It was ugly and useless, but it was our table and we loved it. Not to mention we were loud and we swore a lot, so we kinda stuck ourselves in the corner to not be those people at the game store. The store regularly held events that were kind of like Adventurers League, but not really. On scheduled days, some of their employees would run one-shots that were open to the public. Players would buy tickets and hand them to the DM running that table to join their game. The store was always busier on those days. In half my time, I've never seen another game store do D&D like this. It feels a bit sketchy to me looking back on it, but to be fair, I haven't sat down and played in a store since the last time I saw that old, trashy table. After receiving my acceptance letter, I had a lot of preparations to make. Honestly, as much as my friends were a big part of my life, they still somehow slipped my mind as the enormity of the change my life was about to take had overwhelmed me. I had next to no free time, so I only had a month to arrange everything necessary to move across a dozen state lines, register for college courses, and a lot of other big things my 18-year-old Smallville mind could barely understand. D&D was one of the last things I could think about. It wasn't until I was packing up my GM notes when it dawned on me that I hadn't even told my friends I was moving. I immediately began planning a session. I wanted to surprise them with the news, so instead of telling everyone outright, I strongly hinted to everyone to be prepared for a, quote, thrilling conclusion. This was a bad idea. Do not do this. Be honest with your players. Our last session had left off at a point where I could naturally work in a conclusion to the story. The past few sessions, the party had been working towards rallying all of the orc tribes to march them into battle against the largest human stronghold in the region. After uniting the orcs and assembling their army, the party went to scout ahead. With a little help from some dark divination, they were able to spy on the enemy fort from a hidden vantage point and see that many of the PC's main rivals were stationed there. Night fell, the party made camp, and we ended the session there. Remember how I said we were all very close friends? Well, when I say that, I don't just mean that we had great times together, lent on each other's shoulders to cry on, etc. We knew each other in a biblical sense. Our closeness in real life tended to reflect in game quite often. I bring this up because this led to the discovery of something that, to this day, I have absolutely no explanation for. In-game, the players would sometimes, to put it politely, indulge in their carnal desires with each other and as many people that would willingly, usually, join them. After each of these events, we noticed that they would roll exceptionally well. It was absurd. I've never seen anyone legitimately roll a 17 or higher for an entire encounter before or since, much less every player at the table. Seriously, they once took down a beholder in 2 rounds, and that was after they had just convinced every single one of its cultists to just let them walk into its lair unannounced. Thus, it became a ritual that any time they knew a big fight was coming up, they would orgy. They would have a goddamn orgy for good luck. Now that that's all set up, I can finally get to the meat of this horror story. The day of the planned finale comes around what was possibly the worst time. The 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons had just released, and the game store was busier than I had ever seen it. The play area was almost completely full of people wanting to try out the new 4th edition that was being run by store DMs. It was by far the largest D&D event the store had held as far as I knew. Regardless, I was able to secure our table in the hidden corner. The girls arrived soon after I did, so we were just waiting on one guy to arrive before starting the session. They were asking me what was going on and why they hadn't seen me all week. It was at that moment a random child sat at our table. We were all confused. None of us had seen this kid before. But he sat down and stared at us with a goofy face like he belonged there. I politely told him, "Hey kid, we're not part of the event. You'll have to go to one of the tables over there." The kid just stared at me with that goofy, neutral expression like a wide-eyed Wobbuffet. A few seconds of silence went by before he pulled out a character sheet and tried to hand it to me. I told him again, "No, take it over there." I pointed to one of the other tables. "You can play at one of the tables over there." He didn't even look where I was pointing. He just continued to stare at me with his character sheet out. I was a little creeped out as the kid was actually starting to shake in his chair, but his face remained the same. A moment later, a woman aggressively approached me from behind. She didn't even bother to introduce herself or ask about the situation. She grabbed my arm, spun me around, and immediately started yelling. I instinctively forced myself out of her grip, but that only made her even angrier and louder. I couldn't really tell what she was saying. The only real coherent part was that this kid was her son. The girls were terrified as they were literally trapped in the corner, and I was furious for being attacked in such a way. The kid's face hadn't changed at all during any of this. I tried to get a hold of the situation. "Listen," I said to her. "I don't know what's going on, but this isn't a public game."
"No, you listen," she interrupted me. "My son is here to play this game. He did the paper and everything for it."
"That's great, but there are other tables." Again, she cut me off.
"I don't see why he can't sit here. No one was sitting there, so there shouldn't be a problem."
"Ma'am, I'm trying to explain. This is a rated R game. We are not part of," but she wouldn't let me finish a single sentence.
"I thought Dungeons and whatever was for everyone."
It was like talking to a brick wall. She went back and forth for several minutes without getting anywhere. She clearly had no idea what D&D was. The only reason she was even there was because her son wanted to play, so she brought him to the only game store in the area. From what I gathered, she hadn't even purchased a ticket for her son to play at a table. Even if she had, I wasn't taking tickets because I didn't work at the store. She didn't understand the difference between private and public games. As one would expect, rather than admit she was mistaken or that she didn't know anything about D&D, like a rational person, she immediately tried to turn the blame around on me.
"Well, that doesn't sound anything like what I heard about the game. I don't even think you're a real dungeon master. I want to speak to your manager.
She hadn't even paid attention to a word I was saying. I already told you I don't work here. Ignoring me, she stormed off to the other tables to look for the manager. I looked back at the kid. He was staring at the girls with that same look on his face and his character sheet on the table. He was still shaking like he was sitting on a vibrating chair. It was obvious now that he had some kind of disorder. He probably couldn't help it, but he was still a bit unsettling. None of us knew what to do. A minute of awkward silence went by before Karen came back with some guy I had never seen before. I was thinking she had just found a random Chad to come bully us for her. Seriously, the guy had bigger dude bro energy than a Winklevoss on spring break. Now, I'm pretty tall, 6'6" last I checked, but this guy came up to almost 5'7". Even with his "do you even lift" arms and his "I'm in charge here" pose, I still was not intimidated. He didn't even introduce himself. He just told me I had to let the kid play with us. I told him everything I told Karen, but he was still just as clueless as her. He kept insisting that all DMs in this store were running the same 4E content that day. I said no. I was running a private 3.5E with my friends. That only made him angrier and more hostile. I thought that if he also had no idea what the difference between a private and public session was, then he could not possibly be a manager, much less work at the game store. I told him that if he didn't understand why he was in the wrong, then he needed to leave because he didn't belong there. Every other DM was looking in our direction, looks of shock and awe all around. Karen also couldn't believe that I was talking to the manager like that. She goes on to insult me, personally saying that I would never amount to something as prestigious as even middle management. That, because of my race, I was never going to be anything more than a field worker or a janitor. Wow, racist too? Ladies and gentle crabs, we are getting the full Karen experience. I wanted to save the reveal that I was going to college for after the session, but I was on the warpath now. I had the acceptance letter on me, and I put the Parita in her place. Things got even more heated between Chad and I. He was threatening to kick me out, but I told him he had no right to do so. It was at that point that one of the store employees got involved. She explained that Chad was the new owner. The previous owner had got into some serious financial problems, so he sold the store to this chode. Chad clearly wasn't a gamer, so talk of gaming etiquette and culture was lost on him. Now my only two choices were to let the kid play at our table or he would fire me. I told him I didn't work for him.
Not anymore, you don't,
Karen muttered. It did not matter at that point. Chad's mind was already made up. Nothing I could have said after that would have kept him from kicking me out. I grabbed my stuff and left, the girls following me out. The reason we played at the game store was because we couldn't play at any of our houses for one reason or another. With our only place to play gone, it really didn't matter that our fourth player ended up canceling last minute. The girls and I just spent the night together in my room. I told them what I had planned for that session, but we never did get to properly wrap up that campaign. It's always a shame when a really good campaign suddenly comes to a halt, even when it's just because life gets in the way. TLDR, days before I leave for college, I try to wrap up an ongoing campaign at the local game store. Chad owner thinks I work for him and tries to force me to run a session for Karen's mom's son. Edit. I forgot to describe my plan to wrap up the campaign. I was going to start the session by having Scout hearing the PC orgy from their camp and reporting back to the fort. Remember that nearly all of the PC's main rivals were stationed there. One of the girls was playing as a homebrew warlock subclass that focused on dream magic. Part of her backstory was that she trained at a temple with other students. However, she was denied further teaching when she was caught using forbidden aspects of dream magic to cause nightmares and even summon them to the material plane. Her main rival throughout the campaign was her roommate and training partner from the temple, now a fully trained master of dream magic. She had the ability to psychically link up to 10 creatures' consciousness through what was basically a shared dream. I didn't have a single goal in mind going forward from there. I was going to have the rivals mess with the PCs in the dream and see how things played out. If things started to look grim for the PCs, they would start realizing the error of their ways and slowly start losing their will to fight. They stop the orcs from attacking the fort and the land of men is saved, game over. If the PCs were kicking ass and taking names, then the rivals were pretty much screwed. Their unconscious bodies would be right there in stabbing range when the PCs woke up, with no commanders leading the defense. The last standing fort would be overrun by orcs. Game over. I was basically going to let their roleplay determine the end of my campaign. Would they go for redemption or conquest? My money was on the redemption ending, but I guess we'll never know. End post. Okay, first of all, while this is definitely a horror story in every sense of the word, I just can't help but see some humor in it. Some poor guy just wanted to run a game when somebody who has no idea how D&D works comes in and kicks them out for playing games in his game store. Not only is that horrible management, but it's absolutely brain dead too. That's like kicking somebody out of your bar for drinking. Bad analogies aside, I just personally don't see the game store lasting much longer with leadership like that. Moving on though, I would say that the story does have some sadder undertones though. First, it always sucks when you can't finish a game or a campaign. This must have especially hurt as, aside from the flaker, they could have had a cool ending. But aside from that, hearing about that possibly neurodivergent kid having to watch his mom screaming at people immediately after being excluded from a game must have been upsetting, as this was definitely made obvious by the child shaking. If I was that kid, I would not want to be at that table anymore because even if I was eventually allowed, it would have been made clear that I wasn't wanted there. What should have happened was, when it was initially explained that they weren't supposed to be there, he could have been scooped up and dropped off at an open and welcoming table. While I admit I don't know anything about the kid or their mom, just judging by the fact that it was explained to the mom that it was an R-rated game, and she not only didn't care, but proceeded to scream at everybody in front of her shaking, distraught kid, I can't help but worry a little bit. I don't know, I just feel really bad for the kid and think that the kid is definitely the real victim here. Anyways, I bet you've been wondering what this veil here is for. Well, this is only the latest addition to our channel. Today I unveil what I call the
Compass of Judgment,
where I judge the stories I read and place them somewhere on the compass. As we can see on either corner there is horror and glory with both cringe and funny on either side. So while this story did have some elements that I found funny, this story belongs well within the realm of horror, somewhere right on the border of deep horror with a bit of a funny tilt. Anyways, just before the channel hits 200k, I wanted to fix my audio and introduce a few upgrades too. I hope you appreciate it. But that's not all. I have a lot more in store for you guys moving forward, so if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and as always, thanks for watching.